I think I'm going to give you 10 minutes. So but I was in the edition. I did a case study on Sri Lanka, which is called "Stabilising a Victor's Peace: Humanitarian Action and Reconstruction in Eastern Sri Lanka." Now, the Sri Lanka case is quite different from many of the other cases in this edition, in the special edition. It's not a case where there's a so-called fragile state. It's not a case where there's a heavily militarized international intervention. And so what we're looking at in this case is stabilization through a very concerted and very coherent attempt by a domestic government to impose its own version of stabilization, and demanding that international actors and humanitarians are coherent and integrated into this response. And I suppose what this case shows is the primacy of domestic politics. And I think in a lot of these debates on stabilization and liberal peace building, the focus has been on the international politics, the international political economy. Here it brings a spotlight down onto the domestic. Now, before going on to the case itself, I think there's a couple of important bits of background. Firstly, this government stabilization program came on the back of two very important events. One was a peace process in Sri Lanka. Up until 2005, Sri Lanka was seen as this exemplar of liberal peace building, a Norwegian facilitated peace process, and it seemed at one stage that two sides, the LTT and the government, were going to negotiate a settlement, and a ceasefire actually lasted from 2002 through to 2008. The important thing for what happened next is that this peace process ultimately was seen as illegitimate and created almost an allergic reaction amongst nationalist groups in the south. It was seen as being something that was highly internationalized, increasingly invasive, and threatening the sovereignty of the country, and created new spaces for nationalist groups to mobilize. Secondly, there was the tsunami and the post-tsunami response, which accentuated these pre-existing anxieties, concerns about a very unruly and often seen to be self-serving aid system that was extremely fragmented and fractured. And it just played into this discourse of around neo-colonial intervention. Nationalists mobilized around concerns about conversions, Christians converting Buddhists. And so it played into these long-standing anxieties about international intervention and sovereignty. So partly as a result of those two things, that a new government came into power, first parliamentary elections in 2004 and then presidential elections in 2005. And this new regime had a very different approach to ending the war and bring about its own version of stabilization. Rather than stabilization being associated with liberal peace building and neoliberal reforms, as was the case in with the last regime, this was about a very determined attempt to centralize power and to defeat the LTT militarily. No need for a political settlement. It was essentially about a victor's peace. And the government went about doing this through centralizing power, building up a strong political coalition in the south, drawing upon nationalist bases of support, centralizing power essentially amongst the three Rajapaksa brothers who controlled the main kind of power ministries in the government, fragmenting the opposition, passing new legislation to give them emergency powers, and also utilizing very cleverly the discourse around the war on terror. And finally, one thing that was very important in this story of stabilization was the switch in the international relations kind of orientation of the country from the west towards the east. So essentially diluting the ability of Western powers to get leverage, to apply conditionalities by drawing upon support from India, from Korea, from China and particularly Pakistan and Iran. And so there was a shift towards the east, towards donors who asked less questions about human rights, and also were more concerned and respectful about sovereignty. Now, the case study I look at, having given a little bit of background, is something that's called the Eastern Reawakening Program. And essentially, what happened at East was a test case for the final battles in the north of the country, which led to the defeat of the LTT in Mullaitivu in May 2009. So essentially, it was a fine-tuning of this combination of military, a war for peace, counterinsurgency, attempts to legitimize a new political dispensation through elections, and a major reconstruction package to create a peace dividend. The war in the East, which started in 2006, led to a military victory in 2007. It was framed as a humanitarian war by the government. It was followed then by something very reminiscent of what one sees in Afghanistan now, the so-called kind of clear, hold and build strategy of NATO forces, except it was done far more effectively. Firstly, on the security side, the construction of police posts, military checkposts, a lot of visible security brought into the East. Essentially, this was a kind of a process of internal colonization, clearing the area of any remnants of LTT support, the use of proxy military actors, particularly the Karuna faction, to essentially to police and to monitor the situation. Secondly, elections were held for provincial council and local elections, and this was then a signal for donors to come in and move from humanitarian acts and resettlement interventions into early recovery and reconstruction. It was very clear in talking to donors in Colombo at the time, they felt now was the time for this longer term reconstruction program. It was no longer an emergency. And then finally there was this showcase project of called Reawakening the East, a major reconstruction program drawing upon both Eastern aid, China in particular, road building, Japan, but also some Western donors such as AusAid and USAID also came in on the back of this, the ADB as well, the World Bank. Essentially, the rationale behind this was, it's a very old rationale that development is somehow a shortcut for security. There was no longer the need for a political settlement because economic development in the East would, if you like, curb or blunt the successionist impulse. It would, take away the motivation and inlying grievances which led to the conflict in the first place. Now, the model of development was very much, if you like, old-style hardware investment in economic infrastructure, road building, irrigation systems, lots of kind of visible reconstruction. And the government was very, very clear that it didn't want software. It didn't want community mobilization programs. It wasn't interested in touchy-feely participatory approaches. It very carefully vetted NGO access into these areas. If you were providing economic reconstruction, okay, you could get access, you can get visas. If you're involved in other things such as local peace building, reconciliation, psychosocial activities, then you couldn't get clearance. And there are underlying kind of security, political and economic rationales, kind of logics behind this. First of all, the government was very concerned about the reigniting, the rebuilding of networks in the East which would provide political voice for Tamils and potential sources of opposition. It was also very deeply sceptical about the economic effectiveness of more bottom-up participatory approaches as well. And so donors were invited to come in and support this, with the government very much setting a clear agenda for how they were expected to support it. Clear conditionalities actually were placed on donors, certainly not the other way around. And the government was also very clever at playing off different donors against one another. So if a Western donor was saying, well, there are certain ways we want to do this, and the answer would be, well, we can go into and get money from China and we don't need you, so thank you very much. So in a way there was a shift in terms of the value of a lot of the kind of Western players from being, their value monetarily was decreasing importance, and their value as scapegoats, as ways of mobilising nationalist sentiments, increased. I've run out of time, so just to finish, some of the conclusions on this so-called model of perhaps illiberal peace building in Sri Lanka. There are many commonalities with what you see as the kind of the model in Afghanistan, but there are some important differences. I suppose one is it's far more effective in achieving its stated goals. Domestic actors have longer term goals and they're there for the long term. Their objectives are less about major transformation, at least in terms of the pronouncements that one sees around liberal peace building. It's certainly more conservative. And counterinsurgency and development, whereas rhetorically at least in Afghanistan, it's seen as something that's pursued alongside and in support of a political settlement. In the case of Afghanistan, it's something that's seen as instead of a political settlement. It short circuits the need for a political settlement at all. And this model, in a way, is being looked at very carefully by other neighbouring countries within the region in South Asia and Southeast Asia. Finally, I suppose I'm going to finish now. The implications for international actors. But first of all, it's obvious that the need to be more attuned to domestic politics and how legitimacy is constructed in these kinds of contexts, and how international and local NGOs are part of a very intense drama around the construction of political legitimacy. And it means thinking very carefully not only about material effects of aid, but also the symbolic and the discursive, which in many ways were far more important in this particular case. And finally, although I've kind of painted this picture of a very hegemonic and very top-down kind of stabilisation exercise, I've overstated it in the sense that they're actually on the ground. When you get to the local level, it's much less coherent and much less cohesive and hegemonic than appears. And I could talk more, but perhaps we can in questions, about agencies that did manage to engage in principled ways through quite pragmatic and pragmatic forms of engagement and an acute understanding of the politics. But I've gone on for too long, so I'll finish.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you very